The boss accused the waitress of stealing and made her strip in front of everyone to prove her innocence. But when he saw her body, he was horrified. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The city lay still in the early hours, its towering skyscrapers stretching into the dark, starless sky. A faint hum of distant traffic murmured through the streets, but inside the penthouse on the 37th floor there was silence, the kind of silence that suffocates. Andrew Carter awoke with a sharp inhale, his breath ragged as though he had been running. His body was drenched in sweat, the fabric of his sheets clinging to his back. He sat up abruptly, his hands gripping the edge of the mattress, his chest rising and falling in uneven beats. The dream again. No, not a dream. A memory. He ran a hand through his tousled blonde hair, feeling the dampness at his temples. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering city lights outside his floor-to-ceiling windows. His penthouse was the pinnacle of luxury. Dark mahogany floors, sleek modern furniture, walls adorned with minimalist art worth more than most people's homes. It was a fortress built on success, power, and discipline. And yet, no amount of wealth could keep his demons at bay. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet touching the cold marble floor. For a moment, he stayed there, elbows on his knees, fingers pressed against his forehead, trying to push the images away, but they came flooding back as they always did. The road, the fire, the screaming. Andrew stood, exhaling sharply. He needed a drink. Walking through the dimly lit penthouse, he made his way to the bar in the living room, pouring himself a generous glass of whiskey. The golden liquid caught the faint glow of the city outside as he swirled it in his glass, but he didn't drink. He just stared at it, as if the amber depths could offer him some sort of answer. He turned away, walking towards the vast window that overlooked the city. His reflection stared back at him, a tall, broad-shouldered man in nothing but sweatpants, his lean frame taut with muscle, the chiseled lines of his jaw shadowed with stubble. His blue eyes, however, held something hollow. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, closing his eyes. He needed to stop this. He had built an empire, turned his restaurants into some of the most prestigious dining establishments in the country. He was respected, feared even. He was not the reckless 22-year-old who had sped down that highway so many years ago. But none of that changed what he had done. The memory returned in vivid detail like a film playing behind his eyelids. It had been a humid summer night, the air thick with the scent of asphalt and gasoline. He had been drunk, though not so much that he couldn't drive. Or at least, that's what he had told himself. The party had been wild, the music deafening, the drinks endless. When he stumbled to his car, his friends had laughed, slapping his back, calling him a legend. He had believed them. The road had been mostly empty. He remembered the feeling of the wheel beneath his hands, the smooth hum of the engine, the thrill of speed as he pushed the car faster and faster. The city lights faded behind him, swallowed by the darkness of the countryside. The air had been warm against his face, the wind whipping through his open window. He had felt untouchable. And then he saw it. A small, rusted car ahead of him, moving too slow, crawling, like an insect in his path. Annoyance had flared in him. He was in a hurry. He had things to do, people to see. He had pressed the accelerator. The car ahead didn't move aside. It stayed in its lane, steady, oblivious. A game. That's what it had felt like. A test of dominance. He had swerved into the other lane, gunning the engine, ready to pass. But the driver of the other car had done something unexpected. He had also accelerated. For a moment, it had been almost amusing, a challenge. He had smiled, gripping the wheel, pushing his car harder. And then it happened. The edge of his vehicle barely clipped the other car. Just a small mistake, barely noticeable, but it was enough. The rusted car lost control, spinning wildly before veering off the road. Andrew had slammed his brakes, but not to stop. No. He had only slowed enough to glance into his rearview mirror. He would never forget what he saw. The car crushed against a tree, fire licking at the hood. A figure slumped over the steering wheel. And then another, a smaller one. A child, beaten against the window, screaming, trapped. Andrew's hands tightened around his whiskey glass, his breath shallow. He had sat there for what felt like hours, but had only been seconds. The sounds of distant sirens had shaken him from his paralysis. No one had seen him. No one knew. And so he had left, pressed his foot down on the accelerator and driven away. It had been easy to forget at first. The rush of youth, the distractions of wealth, the thrill of business. He had drowned himself in success, convinced himself that the past was the past. But the nightmares never stopped. Andrew downed the whiskey in one burning gulp, then set the glass down with a sharp click against the bar. He had spent years trying to escape that night, but it always found him. And lately, it had been getting worse. The thought unsettled him. He had everything a man could want. Power, money, influence. His restaurants were among the finest in the city. People respected him, feared him. So why now? Why was the past clawing its way back? His phone buzzed on the table beside him, breaking his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. An email from one of his restaurant managers. There was an issue with staffing. A new hire had started today, and they weren't sure she would last. Andrew exhaled. Good. A distraction. He placed the empty glass in the sink and made his way toward his bedroom. The city was waking up now, the first hints of dawn creeping through the skyline. Tomorrow he would go to the restaurant. Tomorrow he would focus on business. Tomorrow he would forget. Or at least he would try. The sun had barely risen when Andrew Carter stepped into his car. The city was still shaking off the remnants of night, streetlights flickering off as the early morning traffic slowly thickened. The hum of engines and distant car horns provided a familiar backdrop, grounding him in the present. He gripped the steering wheel, inhaling deeply. Last night's dreams still clung to him, like smoke that refused to dissipate. The whiskey had done little to numb the memory. If anything, it had sharpened it. But today was a new day. And Andrew Carter was not a man who dwelled on things he could not change. As he pulled onto the main road, the towering buildings around him reflected the first light of morning. His restaurant was only a short drive away, nestled in the heart of the city's most prestigious district. It wasn't just another high-end establishment. It was an institution. A place where the elite dined, where every detail was meticulously crafted to ensure perfection. And perfection was what Andrew demanded. The moment he stepped through the sleek glass doors, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations hushed, employees straightened their postures, and the kitchen staff moved with renewed urgency. He was more than just the owner. He was a presence. The restaurant had not yet opened to customers, but the staff was already preparing. The scent of fresh bread and seared meat filled the air, mingling with the rich aroma of coffee. The polished marble floors gleamed under the soft lighting, tables set with precise attention to detail. Andrew strode through the space, his eyes scanning every corner, every movement. He had built this place from the ground up, poured years of work into turning it into the empire it was today. And he expected nothing less than excellence from those who worked here. It didn't take long for the manager to approach him. Serge, a sharp-eyed man in his late 40s who had been with Andrew for nearly a decade. Reliable, efficient, and utterly ruthless when it came to maintaining the restaurant's high standards. There was an issue with one of the new hires, Serge said, falling into step beside him. Andrew barely glanced at him. Which one? The new waitress, Naomi. The name didn't ring a bell. Andrew didn't involve himself in every new hire. He had people for that. He had built a team to ensure the restaurant functioned without him micromanaging every detail. But when there were problems, he made sure to handle them personally. What's the issue? She's different. Andrew stopped, finally turning his full attention to the manager. Different how? Serge hesitated. That alone was unusual. The man was not easily unsettled. She's competent, he admitted. Fast, precise, doesn't make mistakes. But she's quiet. Doesn't engage with the staff much. Doesn't try to impress you. She just does her job. Andrew's brow furrowed. And that's a problem? Serge exhaled, lowering his voice. I don't know. There's something about her. Something off. Andrew didn't believe in gut feelings. He believed in results. But Serge wasn't the kind of man to voice concerns over something trivial. He nodded towards the dining area. Where is she? She should be arriving soon. Andrew checked his watch. He had time. He stepped toward the bar area, taking a seat at one of the stools. If this Naomi was about to start her shift, he wanted to see her before she saw him. He observed as staff moved efficiently through their morning routines. The sound of coffee being brewed, the clatter of dishes being set, the soft murmur of employees speaking in hushed tones. Then the doors opened, and she walked in. Andrew straightened slightly, watching as Naomi entered the restaurant. She was young, mid-20s perhaps, tall, with dark brown skin and a slender frame. Her black hair was tied back neatly, revealing sharp, delicate features. She moved with quiet confidence, her posture straight, her stride unhurried. But it wasn't her appearance that caught his attention. It was her eyes. There was something in them, something measured, guarded. Most new employees entered with a certain nervous energy, eager to please, to impress. Naomi didn't. She walked with the air of someone who had no interest in proving herself to anyone, and Andrew didn't like that. He watched as she slipped into the staff area, greeting no one, speaking to no one unless necessary. Other employees acknowledged her, but she responded only with brief nods. She wasn't rude. She simply existed in her own space, detached from the usual workplace camaraderie. Andrew's gaze remained fixed on her as she tied her apron, adjusted the notepad in her pocket, and moved toward the front of the restaurant. She's disciplined, he remarked. Serge nodded. Yes. Andrew tapped his fingers against the counter. She's also completely uninterested in authority. That was what bothered him. He was used to employees who respected him, admired him, feared him, even. Naomi was different. She didn't avoid him, but she didn't acknowledge him beyond what was necessary. And for the first time in a long time, Andrew Carter found himself irritated by someone he barely knew. He decided then and there that he would figure her out. If there was one thing he hated, it was not having control over a situation. And something about Naomi felt out of his control. The day passed in its usual rhythm, but Andrew's attention kept drifting back to her. He watched as she worked, analyzing every move. She was efficient, almost too efficient. Most waitstaff, even the best ones, had moments of hesitation, second-guessing an order, fumbling slightly with the tray, needing a moment to recollect themselves. Naomi didn't. She was seamless, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. every order memorized, every movement precise. But there was no warmth in her actions, no desire to please. She performed her duties flawlessly, yet remained emotionally absent. Andrew found himself trying to provoke a reaction. He deliberately lingered near her as she took orders, observed how she handled customers, how she responded to minor inconveniences. Nothing fazed her. Even when a particularly difficult patron snapped at her over a delayed dish, she simply apologized with a calm, neutral tone and moved on. No irritation, no frustration, no sign of anything at all. Andrew was intrigued. That only made him more determined. He wasn't a man who let things remain unknown. And Naomi was an unknown. That meant one thing. He would have to push her, find her breaking point, see what was beneath that unreadable expression. The thought sent an unfamiliar thrill through him. He didn't just want to understand her. He wanted to see what happened when she was forced to react. Andrew Carter never liked unfinished puzzles. He built his success on control, on knowing every variable, every outcome before anyone else even saw the pieces fallen into place. And Naomi was a puzzle, a jagged, unfitting piece in a carefully arranged picture, something that refused to conform to the smooth, predictable patterns of his world. For days he had watched her, tested her, waited for a reaction that never came. She remained indifferent, neither cold nor warm, neither rebellious nor eager to please. It irritated him in a way he couldn't explain. Employees either feared him or respected him, sometimes both. But Naomi? She simply didn't care. That should have been the end of it. He had more important things to focus on: contracts, investors, the expansion of his restaurant empire. And yet, here he was, sitting in his office going through the week's inventory reports. A missing case of imported truffles, bottles of expensive wine unaccounted for, a few prime cuts of Wagyu beef that had never been plated. He ran his fingers along the printed numbers, eyes narrowing. Theft. It wasn't uncommon in high-end restaurants, staff sneaking out supplies to sell or use for themselves. It was a problem he had eliminated long ago, with strict policies and cameras covering every inch of the storage rooms. If someone was stealing from him, they were either very stupid or very bold. His mind immediately went to Naomi, not because he had proof, but because she was an anomaly, and anomalies led to suspicion. A slow, deliberate plan formed in his mind. If she wasn't guilty, she would prove it. If she was, well, then he'd have all the justification he needed to remove her from his restaurant. Either way, he would get an answer. By the time the restaurant was preparing to close that night, the tension in the air was almost suffocating. The dining room had emptied, the last of the guests filtering out into the cool night. The waitstaff was cleaning tables, the kitchen staff finishing their breakdown, the bartenders securing bottles for the night. Andrew stepped into the center of the restaurant, his presence drawing every eye. "Everyone, stop what you're doing." The low murmur of conversation died instantly. Staff exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the weight in his voice. Even Serge looked slightly surprised by the sudden announcement. "We have a problem," Andrew continued, his voice even, controlled. "There have been recent inventory discrepancies, expensive items going missing, food, alcohol, theft." A ripple of shock went through the employees. Some whispered to one another, others shifted uncomfortably. Andrew let the silence stretch just long enough for the discomfort to settle before he spoke again. "And I intend to find out who is responsible." His eyes scanned the room, deliberately slow, letting the tension build. Then they landed on Naomi. Naomi. She barely reacted, only straightened slightly as every other pair of eyes turned toward her. Her expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in her gaze, brief, like a shadow passing over water. Andrew stepped forward, the room utterly still. "I'd like you to empty your bag." A sharp intake of breath from someone in the room. One of the younger waitresses put a hand over her mouth. Others looked between Naomi and Andrew, frozen in place. Naomi didn't speak. She simply looked at him, not with fear, not with anger, just looked. Andrew waited. The moment stretched too long, the silence pressing down on the air like an unbearable weight. Then, finally, she reached for her bag. She unzipped it slowly, deliberately, and upturned its contents onto the nearest table. Keys, a wallet, a phone, a few receipts, a pen, nothing else. A few whispered murmurs ran through the staff, but no one spoke aloud. Andrew's jaw tightened. This should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. His instinct told him there was something more. That's not enough. Naomi's fingers twitched slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Take off your sweater." Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. A line had been crossed. Andrew knew it. The staff knew it. The moment the words left his mouth, the tension in the room shifted. It wasn't a request, it was an order. He had backed her into a corner, and yet, still, she did not speak. She only moved. Slowly, methodically, she gripped the hem of her sweater and pulled it over her head, revealing the thin black tank top underneath. And the scars. The room collectively inhaled. They ran along her arms, her shoulders, disappearing beneath the fabric covering her collarbone. Jagged, uneven, old burns, healed over time but unmistakable in their severity. The kind of scars that didn't just happen. The kind that told a story of pain, of survival. Andrew felt the world shift beneath him. His breath caught, a sickening familiarity slamming into his chest like a fist. He had seen scars like that before. He had seen them in his nightmares. He had seen them in the burning wreckage of a car he had abandoned years ago. His pulse pounded in his ears, the restaurant fading around him. The sound of crackling fire, of shattering glass, of desperate screams clawed their way through his memory. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. And yet, as he stared at Naomi, at the scars marking her body, something deep inside him knew. It was her. The girl from the fire. The child he had left to die. He couldn't breathe. Naomi's eyes met his, dark and steady, unreadable. If she recognized him, she gave no indication. Andrew felt something inside him crack. Panic, guilt, horror. He didn't know what to do, didn't know what to say. "Everyone is dismissed." The words left his mouth before he even realized he had spoken. The staff hesitated, unsure of what had just happened, but no one dared question him. Chairs scraped, feet shuffled, the soft murmur of confusion rising as people began filing out. Serge gave him a long, questioning look but said nothing. Naomi was the last to move. She simply picked up her sweater, folded it neatly over her arm, and walked away without a word. Andrew stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had spent years running from that night, burying it beneath wealth and success, pretending it had never happened. But fate had brought it back to him, in the shape of the woman he had just tried to break. Andrew Carter stood motionless in the empty restaurant, his breath uneven, his mind caught between the present and the past. The image of Naomi's bare arms, her shoulders covered in jagged scars, burned itself into his memory, merging with the nightmare that had haunted him for years. It was her. It had to be her. The girl in the burning car, the one he had left behind. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had built his entire life on control, on never letting anything slip past him. And yet, fate had placed her in his restaurant, standing in front of him, revealing the evidence of what he had done. The realization should have crushed him, should have made him crumble. But instead, a deep, gnawing panic coiled in his chest, suffocating, twisting like a rope tightening around his throat. He turned sharply and walked toward his office, slamming the door shut behind him. He paced, running a hand through his hair, gripping the edge of his desk so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The air in the room felt too thin, like he couldn't get enough oxygen. He had spent 15 years pretending that night didn't define him, and now it was standing in his dining room looking at him with unreadable eyes. The shame was immediate, overwhelming. He had forced her into that moment. He had humiliated her in front of everyone. And for what? Because she hadn't responded to him the way he expected? Because she wasn't afraid of him? Because he needed to feel in control? And in doing so, he had stripped away the very thing that had kept his sins buried. She had never confronted him. She had never accused him. Which meant one terrifying thing. She didn't recognize him. His breath hitched at the thought. She didn't know who he was. His mind reeled, spinning through the possibilities. Could it be true? Could she really not remember? He had been just a shadow that night, a faceless figure in a speeding car, a nameless man who had left her behind. Maybe the trauma had blurred the details. Maybe the fire had been too intense, the smoke too thick. Or maybe she did know. Maybe she had known from the start. Maybe this was all a game, a slow, calculated torment, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The paranoia sank into his bones. The uncertainty gnawed at him. He needed to know. He needed answers. And there was only one way to get them. The next day, Naomi arrived at the restaurant as if nothing had happened. Andrew watched from his office window as she stepped inside, moving through the space with the same quiet precision as always. No hesitation, no avoidance, no fear. She tied her apron, adjusted the notepad in her pocket, and slipped into her routine like clockwork. The other employees whispered, stealing glances at her, clearly expecting some kind of fallout after what had happened the night before. But she gave them nothing. Andrew clenched his jaw. He had seen fear before. He had seen guilt. He had seen anger, resentment, defiance, but he had never seen someone react to humiliation with nothing. He needed to talk to her, alone. He stepped out of his office, his presence causing an immediate shift in the air. Employees moved out of his way, conversations ceased, and the nervous energy from last night still lingered among the staff. But Naomi remained unaffected. "Naomi," he called, his voice even, controlled. She turned to face him. "Come with me." For the first time, he saw something flicker across her expression. It was brief, gone before he could name it, but she obeyed, following him through the back hallway, past the kitchen, into the private office he rarely used for anything other than meetings with investors. He closed the door behind them. She stood across from him, arms crossed, waiting. Andrew had spent his life commanding rooms, intimidating people into submission, bending situations to his will. But now, standing before the woman he had once condemned to fire, he felt stripped bare. He didn't even know what to say. Apologizing felt meaningless. Asking if she remembered him felt dangerous. But he had to know. "Sit," he ordered. She didn't move. He let out a slow breath, trying to steady himself. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. The words tasted foreign on his tongue. "What happened last night? I crossed a line." Still, she said nothing. A tension stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Andrew leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "Why didn't you say anything?" Naomi tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes piercing through him. About what? He didn't answer immediately. He watched her, searching for any flicker of recognition, any crack in her composure. "The scars," he finally said. "You let them see, but you didn't explain." For the first time, she smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't kind. It was a knowing, sharp-edged thing. Would it have changed anything? The words sent an unexpected chill down his spine. She knew. She had always known that the world didn't care about explanations, that people like him, men in power, didn't listen. He felt the weight of her words settle into his chest. This wasn't about him. It never had been. It was about her survival, about the years of learning to exist in a world that never gave her space to speak. Andrew exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He had built his life around control, around shaping the world to fit his needs, but for the first time, he had met someone who existed outside of it, someone he couldn't manipulate. And that terrified him because no matter how much money he had, no matter how much power he held, he could never erase the past. He could never undo what he had done. And Naomi, she would never let him forget, even if she never spoke of it, even if she never accused him. Her very existence was a reminder that some sins could never be buried. And Andrew Carter, the man who had spent his life outrunning his ghosts, had just realized he would never outrun this one. Andrew Carter sat in the dim light of his office, his hands clasped together, fingers steepled under his chin. Outside, the city thrived, bustling with energy, with purpose. But inside this room, inside his own mind, there was only suffocating stillness. The past had always been something distant, something he could push aside, drown out with business, power, and control. But not anymore. Naomi had forced the past into the present without saying a single word. She didn't have to. The scars on her skin had said everything. Andrew ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. He had always considered himself a man of action, someone who solved problems efficiently. But this wasn't a business negotiation, wasn't a legal issue that could be buried under paperwork and settlements. This was a sin that no amount of power could erase. His first instinct had been to avoid her, to keep his distance, to pretend she wasn't there. But that was impossible. She existed in his space now, moving through his restaurant, through his life, as if she had always belonged there. And maybe, in some cruel twist of fate, she did. But what was worse, she wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't seeking revenge. She simply was. That terrified him more than anything, because it meant she was stronger than him, and that meant he had to do something. The next morning, Andrew was at the restaurant before the sun had fully risen. He had barely slept, the weight of his thoughts pressing too heavily on his chest to allow for rest. His staff arrived one by one, exchanging quiet greetings as they prepared for another busy day. And then she walked in. Naomi. She moved the same way she always did, silent, composed, existing as if untouched by the chaos around her. As if last night's conversation hadn't happened at all. Andrew watched her, his mind racing with questions. Did she expect him to do something? To acknowledge what had happened? To apologize again? She had given him nothing, and that alone made him feel powerless. "Mr. Carter," Serge's voice cut through his thoughts, "we need to discuss the new vendor contracts." Andrew forced himself to nod, but his attention remained on Naomi as she disappeared into the staff area. No, he wouldn't let this sit. He needed answers. By midday, he found himself in the back hallway near the break room, waiting. He had never lingered in these spaces before. This was where employees gathered, not where owners belonged. But today, he had no interest in playing by the usual rules. When Naomi stepped out of the break room, she stopped at the sight of him. Their eyes met. She didn't look surprised. Of course she didn't. Andrew exhaled, keeping his voice even. "Come with me." She didn't argue, didn't ask why. She simply followed. They walked through the narrow corridors, past the kitchen, out the back entrance of the restaurant where the loading docks were. The alley was quiet, cut off from the noise of the city. Andrew turned to face her. "I want to help." The words felt foreign on his tongue. He wasn't a man who helped. He was a man who fixed, who controlled, who dictated outcomes. But with Naomi, those tactics didn't work. Her expression remained unreadable, but he caught the subtle shift in her posture, an almost imperceptible tilt of her head, as if considering him. He hesitated. "Your mother. I know she's sick." A flicker of something crossed her face, something sharp and immediate, but it was gone before he could place it. "I can pay for her treatment," he continued. "Whatever she needs. Better doctors, care facilities, anything." She remained silent, her eyes locked onto his, searching. Andrew's stomach twisted. He wasn't used to feeling uncertain, wasn't used to offering something without the guarantee of getting something in return. Finally, she spoke. "Why?" The single word cut through him like a blade. He opened his mouth, but the truth felt too heavy. "Because I owe you. Because I left you to die. Because I see your scars every time I close my eyes, and I can't live with what I did." Instead, he said, "Because I can." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, she nodded. Just like that, the deal was made. But Andrew knew this wasn't about money. This was about something deeper, and for the first time in his life he didn't know if he could handle it. The next few days passed in a blur of transactions and arrangements. Andrew made the calls himself, sparing no expense in ensuring Naomi's mother received the best medical care available. He arranged for specialists, for round-the-clock care, for things he knew she could never afford on her own. But he didn't tell Naomi why, and she didn't ask. She simply accepted it. And that, somehow, made it worse. He expected her to fight him, to reject his offer, to demand something from him, but she did none of that. She simply took what he gave, as if it had nothing to do with him at all. And in doing so, she reminded him that no matter how much money he threw at this, it would never change what he had done. The past was still there, waiting. And Naomi, she was still a mystery, one he wasn't sure he would ever solve. A week later, she didn't show up for work. Andrew noticed immediately. He didn't want to admit that, didn't want to acknowledge that he had been unconsciously looking for her the moment he walked into the restaurant. But when her absence became clear, a knot tightened in his chest. It wasn't like her. She was never late, never missed a shift. Without thinking, he went to Serge. "Where's Naomi?" Serge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the question. "She called out. Something about her mother." Andrew's pulse quickened. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and walked out the door. 30 minutes later, he was standing outside a small, aging apartment complex in a part of town he had never set foot in before. The building was worn, the paint peeling, the metal railings rusted. It was a far cry from the luxury he was accustomed to. He knocked on the door. Silence. Then, slowly, it opened. Naomi stood in the doorway, wearing a loose sweatshirt, her dark eyes slightly red, as if she hadn't slept. She stared at him, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked tired. Andrew exhaled, lowering his voice. "Can I come in?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then she stepped aside. Just like that, he crossed the threshold into her world. A world he never should have been a part of. But now, it was too late to turn back. The apartment was small, cramped, nothing like the polished, expansive spaces Andrew was used to. The walls were a muted beige, scuffed with time, and the air smelled of old books and something medicinal. A single window let in a sliver of light, casting long shadows across the modest furniture. Naomi closed the door behind him, her expression unreadable as always. But there was something different about her now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Or maybe he had just never seen it. He stepped inside carefully, feeling out of place, like an intruder in a world he had no right to enter. Then, from the other side of the room, a quiet voice. "Who's there?" Andrew turned his head, and his breath hitched. An older woman lay on the worn couch, partially covered by a knitted blanket. Her body was frail, her dark skin stretched thin over delicate bones. She struggled to sit up, her fingers gripping the edge of the cushion for balance. Her eyes, tired but sharp, flicked toward him with quiet suspicion. Naomi moved past him, her presence immediately softening as she approached the woman. "It's my boss," she said simply, her voice quieter than usual. Andrew forced himself to nod, clearing his throat. "Mrs. Rhodes, I assume?" The woman's eyes lingered on him before she nodded slowly. "You must be the one paying all these bills." There was no gratitude in her tone, only quiet acknowledgement, as if she understood that nothing in this world came for free. Andrew wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had expected Naomi to push back against his help, but he hadn't considered what her mother might think of it. Naomi sat at the edge of the couch, her fingers resting lightly on the woman's arm. A silent exchange passed between them, one that he couldn't interpret but somehow felt deeply. Then her mother sighed. "You don't have to keep standing like a stranger," she muttered, shifting slightly. "Sit down." For the first time in a long time, Andrew hesitated before taking a seat in the worn chair across from them. The silence that followed was thick. He had spent years in negotiations, business meetings, high-stakes deals, where silence was a weapon, a way to unnerve the opposition. But this wasn't one of those moments. This was something else entirely. Finally, the older woman spoke. "Why are you really here, Mr. Carter?" He looked at Naomi, then back at her mother. "I wanted to check in, to make sure you were all right." Her mother let out a low hum, unconvinced. "People like you don't just give away money and walk away." Naomi said nothing. Andrew exhaled slowly. "You're right," he admitted. "I don't." Her mother studied him carefully, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion in her face. "Then what do you want?" The truth sat on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. He didn't know what he wanted. Maybe absolution. Maybe something as simple as understanding. But he knew he wouldn't find it here. Not yet. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I owe Naomi more than just money." His voice was low, firm. "More than you know." The weight of those words settled into the space between them. Naomi's mother didn't look surprised. If anything, she seemed to have already known. After a long pause, she simply nodded. "Then you'd better figure out what to do with that debt, Mr. Carter." The conversation ended shortly after that. He didn't stay long, sensing that his presence was a disturbance more than a comfort. Naomi walked him to the door, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Before he stepped out, she finally spoke. "You're trying to fix something that can't be fixed." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something fragile. He turned slightly, meeting her gaze. "I have to try." Naomi studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. "Then you'll have to live with knowing that trying isn't always enough." And with that, she closed the door. The words stayed with him long after he left. He had expected her to be angry, to demand answers, but she had done neither. She had simply let him bear the weight of his own guilt. It was worse than any punishment she could have given him. For the first time in his life, Andrew Carter didn't know how to move forward, but he knew he couldn't keep running, and that terrified him more than anything. The city outside Andrew's penthouse was quiet. The streets below, usually filled with life, felt distant and removed, like a world that had nothing to do with him. He stood near the massive windows, watching the skyline as the lights flickered across towering buildings. But his mind wasn't here. It was back in that small, cramped apartment. Back in the silence that had followed Naomi's words. "You're trying to fix something that can't be fixed." He had left that night feeling something he hadn't felt in years, helpless. Andrew Carter had spent his life believing that anything could be fixed. That money, influence, power, these were the tools that could bend the world to his will. But Naomi was right. Some things couldn't be fixed. And yet, he couldn't let it go. Not because he wanted to feel better, not because he wanted her forgiveness, but because he couldn't live with the idea that he had destroyed someone's life and walked away unchanged. And so, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He acted. The next morning, Andrew's driver pulled up in front of one of the best medical clinics in the city. He stepped out, his usual confidence in his stride, but inside, something felt different. He wasn't here for business. He was here for something far more complicated. Dr. Calloway was waiting for him in his office, a man in his 60s with a steady gaze and a reputation for being the best. Andrew didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need a full medical evaluation for a patient," he said, settling into the chair across from the doctor's desk. "A woman. Burn scars, extensive. I want to know if there are reconstructive options." Dr. Calloway studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Do you have the patient's medical history?" Andrew hesitated. "No." The doctor's expression didn't change. "Then I assume she doesn't know you're doing this?" Andrew exhaled. "Not yet." Calloway leaned back slightly. "And why do you care?" It was a simple question, one Andrew had no simple answer for. "Because I should have cared a long time ago." The doctor didn't press him for more. Instead, he nodded, pulling out a tablet. "We can arrange a consultation, but ultimately, the decision has to be hers." Andrew knew that. He had no right to make this choice for her, but he could at least give her the choice to begin with. Days passed, and Naomi returned to work as if nothing had happened. She moved through the restaurant with the same quiet efficiency, her expression unreadable. But Andrew could see the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way she carried herself with just a little less precision than before. She had spent years surviving. He could see it now, and he wasn't sure if what he was doing was going to help, or if it was just another selfish attempt to balance the scales in his own mind. But it was too late to stop. When her shift ended that evening, Andrew was waiting. Naomi barely glanced at him as she stepped outside, pulling her coat around her shoulders. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said simply. Andrew fell into step beside her. "Doing what?" "Waiting. I need to talk to you." She sighed, as if already tired of the conversation before it even began. "About what?" He hesitated for a brief moment, then decided there was no point in dragging it out. "I spoke to a surgeon." That stopped her. She turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his. For the first time in a long time, he saw something other than indifference in her expression. He continued before she could say anything. "I didn't make any decisions. I just wanted to know if there were options." Naomi was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she spoke. "And?" Andrew exhaled. "There are." Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. "You had no right." "I know." She let out a soft, bitter laugh. "But you did it anyway." He didn't deny it. Because what could he say? That he had been lying awake at night thinking about it? That every time he looked at her he saw the fire, the wreckage, the moment he had left her behind? That he couldn't stop trying to undo the past even when he knew it was impossible? "I'm not asking you to say yes," he said quietly, "but I needed you to know it's possible." Naomi stared at him for a long time. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. That night, Andrew didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. The scars, the way she had looked at him, tired, resigned. He had done the wrong thing again, hadn't he? He had pushed when he should have waited. He had tried to fix her, when all she had ever done was live with the consequences of his mistake. Andrew Carter was not a good man, but for the first time in his life he wanted to be, even if it was too late. 2 days passed, and Naomi didn't speak to him. She showed up to work, did her job, and left. Andrew knew better than to push again. But then, on the 3rd day, she walked into his office. He hadn't expected it. He had been reviewing inventory reports, drowning himself in work in an attempt to clear his mind. When he looked up and saw her standing there, he felt something tighten in his chest. Naomi closed the door behind her, then slowly sat down across from him. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she spoke. "I was unconscious for most of it." Andrew froze. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were distant, her fingers tracing the seam of her sleeve. "I don't remember much," she continued, "just flashes, the fire, the smell, my mother screaming. And then—" She hesitated. "Nothing." Andrew swallowed, his throat dry. "I woke up in the hospital. They told me I'd been pulled out before the car exploded, that someone had stopped." She exhaled, but no one ever came forward. Andrew felt something inside him crack. She didn't know, not entirely. She had spent years believing that some stranger had saved her, not that the man responsible for the crash had left her to die. She looked at him then, and for the first time her expression wasn't unreadable. It wasn't indifferent. It was searching. "Why do you care so much, Andrew?" He felt his breath catch. For the first time since this had started, he realized something. He could still lie. He could still keep this truth buried, still let her believe that he was just some guilt-ridden man trying to help. Or he could tell her the truth and risk losing whatever fragile understanding existed between them. His heart pounded, and then, in the smallest voice, she asked, "Were you there?" The world stopped. Andrew couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because this was it, the moment everything would break. And he didn't know if he was ready to face the wreckage. The silence in the office was suffocating. Andrew could hear the faint hum of the city outside, the distant chatter of the restaurant staff finishing up their shifts, but inside this room, it was as if time had frozen. Naomi sat across from him, her posture straight, her hands resting in her lap, fingers loosely interlocked. But her eyes, dark and unwavering, were locked onto his, waiting. "Were you there?" The question hung between them like a blade. For a moment, Andrew considered lying. It would be so easy. He could shake his head, feign confusion, let her believe whatever she had believed for years. He could walk away from this, let the past stay buried and keep whatever fragile peace they had built. But he knew that would be a mistake. Naomi wasn't stupid. She had seen the way he looked at her, the way his demeanor had shifted ever since the moment she revealed her scars. She had felt the weight of his guilt long before she ever asked the question. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, his fingers tightening around the edge of his desk. His chest felt tight, his throat dry, but he forced the words out anyway. "Yes." Naomi didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't even blink. Andrew had expected something: anger, shock, disgust, some kind of reaction that would confirm what he had feared all along. But she simply sat there, as still as ever, studying him as if trying to decide what to do with this new information. Andrew swallowed hard. "I was there," he continued, his voice quieter now. "I was the one who caused the accident." Still nothing, no outburst, no raised voice, no accusations, just silence. Andrew leaned forward slightly, elbows on his desk, trying to force himself to meet her gaze. "I was drunk," he admitted. "I shouldn't have been driving. I was young, reckless. I didn't think. His voice caught, but he forced himself to continue. "I saw your car lose control. I saw it hit the tree. And I saw the fire." He stopped, his stomach twisting, bile rising in his throat. This was the part he had never spoken aloud, not to anyone, not even to himself. "I saw you." His voice was barely more than a whisper. "I saw you in the window. I heard you screaming." Naomi inhaled sharply, her first real reaction since he had started speaking. Andrew closed his eyes briefly, his hands clenching into fists before he forced them open again. "And I left." The words felt like poison leaving his body. Naomi's lips parted slightly, but she still didn't speak. Andrew exhaled shakily. "I was a coward. I was afraid of what would happen if anyone found out. I told myself there was nothing I could do, that it was already too late." He swallowed. "But I knew. I knew I should have stopped. I knew I should have pulled you out of that car." Finally, Naomi moved. Her hands uncurled from each other, her fingers pressing lightly against the armrests of the chair, as if grounding herself. She inhaled again, slow and controlled, before letting her gaze drop to the desk between them. "How long have you known?" Her voice was quiet. Andrew exhaled. "Since the moment I saw your scars." Naomi's jaw tensed slightly, and she nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. Then, slowly, she stood. Andrew felt his heart pound as she moved, his entire body tensing as if bracing for the inevitable. He wouldn't stop her if she decided to leave. He wouldn't blame her if she reported him, if she walked out of this office and never looked back. He deserved it. But Naomi didn't storm out. She took a step forward, then another. And then she was standing in front of his desk, close enough that he could see every detail of her face, the way her expression shifted between unreadable calm and something deeper, something raw. She lifted her hands slowly, reaching for the collar of her sweater. Andrew barely had time to register what she was doing before she pulled it over her head, revealing the thin tank top underneath, revealing her scars. They were worse up close, jagged, uneven, some darker than others, stretching across her shoulders, down her arms, marks of a past that she had never been given the choice to escape. Andrew couldn't breathe. Naomi didn't speak. She simply stood there, letting him see, letting him truly look. Then, after a long, heavy pause, she spoke. "I don't need your guilt." The words cut deeper than anything else she could have said. Andrew opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Naomi pulled her sweater back on, her movements slow, deliberate. When she met his eyes again, her expression was unreadable once more, but there was something different now, a quiet acceptance, not of him, of the truth. "I've spent years being angry," she said finally, "at the world, at fate, at the fact that no one came for me that night." She paused. "I thought that if I ever found the person responsible, I'd want to hurt them. I thought I'd want to destroy their life the way they destroyed mine." Andrew's hands tightened into fists. He wouldn't fight it. If she wanted revenge, he wouldn't stop her. But she shook her head. "I don't feel that way anymore." Andrew's breath caught. Naomi's gaze softened, just slightly, but there was still a quiet strength behind her words. "You were a coward that night, Andrew, and you're going to have to live with that for the rest of your life." He swallowed. "I know. But I refuse to let what you did define me anymore." The words hit him harder than any punishment ever could. Naomi exhaled, glancing away for a brief moment before meeting his eyes again. "I'm not giving you forgiveness. You don't get to have that." Andrew felt something tighten in his chest. "But I'm also not giving you my hatred," she continued, "because that would mean letting you take up more space in my life than you already have." He didn't know what to say. This was worse than anger, worse than hatred. It was freedom for her and an unmovable weight for him. She had let go, and now he had to carry it. Naomi took a small step back. "I'm leaving the restaurant." Andrew felt the words hit him like a physical blow, but he didn't argue. She had earned the right to leave. She had earned the right to never see him again. "When?" he asked, his voice rough. "Tomorrow." Andrew exhaled slowly, nodding. "If you ever need anything, I won't." He let out a quiet, bitter chuckle. "Right." Naomi turned, walking toward the door, but just before she reached it, she stopped. For a moment, Andrew thought she might say something else, but she didn't. She simply glanced back, just once, and then she was gone. Andrew sat there for a long time after she left. The city outside continued moving, cars passing, people laughing, living their lives. And inside this office, in the quiet of his own making, Andrew Carter finally understood what it meant to be haunted. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out more videos for other gripping stories, and feel free to share this video with others who might like it too.